like to welcome you to Just Festival and to actually what I think is a really very special event, and I've been really looking forward to this. Hello, Minneapolis. How you doing? So my name is Helen True, and I'm Just Festival Director. Just Festival is Edinburgh's arts, human rights and interfaith festival. And through our festival each year, we bring together speakers, performers and audiences who care about social justice, peace and a shared understanding. So this evening's event by Ragamala Dance, entitled Returning to the Earth, resonates, I think, very deeply for our time and particularly our recent experience. It also resonates across the world of people of faith and people of no faith, I have to say, as well, because I think we are brought together through a kind of shared experience over the past year with COVID as well, and having to face some of the kind of darkness within our communities. We've all found a way to try and understand and express that. So before we start, I have a little bit of housekeeping to do that I need to go through. I want to tell you that this evening's event is a webinar, and so this means that you won't be able to see or hear any of the other attendees, but we very, very much want you to comment, interact, post your questions for our presenters as we go along. So please take a little minute and have a look at the bottom of your screen and find your Q&A button, which I think a lot of you have done. Our panelists can see these, and I will also help moderate as we go along. Please do note that this evening's event is being recorded by kind permission of our panelists. And if you want to leave a comment or have a question, sometimes you might prefer to do that anonymously, or if you would like to use your name, that's very nice, and we can say hello to you directly. So the evening will last approximately 1 hour, but we won't guillotine that exactly. We'll just find a natural closing point, and we have around sort of 10 minutes leeway either way. I'll pop into the picture around 15 minutes before the end, just to give a bit of a time check and prep you for your final chance to pose that burning question. So it is my huge pleasure to hand over the chairing of this evening's event to Virajita Singh. Now, Virajita is Associate Vice Provost in the Office of Equity and Diversity, where she brings her expertise in design thinking and partnership studies to catalyse and support equity and diversity work of colleagues and other academic units at the University of Minnesota. Virajita is also a practicing visual artist herself and a passionate supporter of the arts in all its forms, and also volunteers as a museum guide at the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts. So we are in very good hands as a guide through this conversation. So welcome to you all, and thank you to all our panelists, and over to you, Virajita.
Thank you so much, Helen. I'm delighted and honored to be here and to facilitate a conversation with our panelists, who I will introduce after we first watch a very special video of the performance of the fires of Varanasi. It's a 20-minute video, so sit back and relax, and we will gather after this, and I will introduce the panelists, and then we will go on to questions. In the meantime, as you watch the performance, please feel free to start adding your questions to the Q&A as they come up, even as you watch the performance. So thank you. Can we please have the video? Thank you for that incredible performance. I hope the audience, you enjoyed it as much as I did. Really breathtaking. I'm going to start with introducing our panelists, and I'll start with the two co-directors of the very performance we saw, or the excerpt of the performance we saw, Fires of Varanasi. And I'll start with Rani Ramaswamy, who is a founder and co-artistic director of Ragamala Dance Company, with her choreographic partner and daughter, Aparna Ramaswamy, also here today. Rani is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, Research Fellowship at the Rockefeller Foundation, Bellagio Center in Italy, Residential Fellowship at the Bogliasco Foundation Center, Italy, the Doris Duke Performing Arts Award, United States Artist Fellowship, a McKnight Distinguished Artist Award, a Bush Fellowship for Choreography, and 15 McKnight Artist Fellowships for the choreography and interdisciplinary art, among others. So really, we have amazing panelists here today. And Aparna next. Aparna Ramaswamy is also co-artistic director of Ragamala Dance Company with her choreographic partner, who I just introduced, and described by the New York Times as the thrillingly three-dimensional, rapturous, and profound. Aparna is a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, Research Fellowship at the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center, and also the Doris Duke Performing Arts Award. She is an empaneled artist with the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, and her solo work with live music has toured the US and India with support from the National Dance Project and US Artists International. So next, I'm going to go to Mary Ann Kennedy, who's a Scottish Gael, brought up in the urban diaspora of Glasgow with roots in the islands of Skye, which I believe she's speaking from there, and Tiree. She was brought up in a multicultural part of the city where a mother tongue that was not English was the norm. Her mother's family are well-known Gaelic tradition bearers, but she is also trained as a classical musician at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland and the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester. And finally, I welcome Pádraig Ó Tuama, an Irish poet and theologian. His work has been published widely in the Harvard Review, the Academy of American Poets, Poetry Ireland, and many others. He presents Poetry Unbound with On Being, a podcast exploring a single poem, and to date, the first of 4 series of that podcast had nearly 5 million downloads. He has worked as a conflict mediator for many years in his native Ireland, addressing questions to do with borders, partition, as well as political and religious divides. Incredible. I'm honored to be in your presence. I'm going to turn to Mary Ann Kennedy because she has kindly agreed to perform a piece, and then we'll go on to Pádraig after.
Thank you very much, Virajita, and congratulations on that beautiful performance that we saw highlights from Rani and Aparna. It was really moving, especially when you appreciate that it is a close family connection out of which this all springs. So I'm going to sing something that comes from my family tradition. My mum comes from the northwest of the Isle of Skye, where the MacLeods were the hereditary chiefs, and they were one of the last noble families to retain a full cultural squad in their castle. It included a harp player and a bard and a piper. And the family of pipers were the MacCrimmons, the most famous of whom was Pádraig Ó Tuama. And he had a large family and sadly lost them all to smallpox. But it was the loss of the youngest child, who was his favourite, that caused him the greatest grief. And this is a very short song, and it becomes the theme for a pibreach, the classical music of the Great Highland Bagpipe, which is a theme and variation form and becomes ever more intricate and more intense in its emotion. But when you strip it back to its original song form, the simplicity of this tiny song is every bit as intense for me. It's called Idichin, the young lad with the dark hair. Idichin dai, hook me go. Idichin dai, hook me go. Hook me go, please hook me go. Hook me go, nacht hook me go. Idichin dai, hook me go. Idichin dai, hook me go. Idichin dai, hook me go. Hook me go, is hook me go. Hook me go, nacht hook me go. Idichin dai, hook me go.
Wow, that was wonderful. You can feel the emotions following the fires of Varanasi. To hear the Scottish dialect is amazing. So I think we continue in that form to turn to Pádraig to share his creation, which is a poem he's going to read.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Ragamala and to Marianne and to you, Virajita, for the opportunity to be all here together, and to Just Festival. I trained as a theologian, and one of the things that strikes me within that is that often religious traditions around the world have a deep interest in telling an origin story of the world, how it all began. And these stories are usually primal in their imagination: a garden, a river, a sky, a tree, a dance, a betrayal. All of these things can often be present. They can be filled with anticipation and joy, as well as threat and death. Over the years of studying creation narratives, I became really interested in how creation narratives were, on the one hand, mythologizing the past, but usually doing that in order to be able to say something powerful about the present. They're not interested really in forensic sciences as to whether they're accurate or not. That's not the purpose of a poem. The purpose of a poem is to make sense. And I see that creation narratives in all their many forms are seeking to assert a certain kind of ritualistic sense-making, perhaps like a conversation with who it is we wish to believe ourselves to be in all our complexities. Creation narratives are rarely purist. They're usually filled with a reality of how flawed the human person can be. So here's a contribution of mine to creation narratives, if I might be so bold. This poem is called Make Believe. And on the first day, God made something up. Then everything came along. Seconds, sex, and beasts, and breaths, and rabies, hunger, healing, lust and lust's rejections, swarming things that swarm inside the dirt, girth and grind and grit and shit and all shit's functions. Rings inside the tree trunk and branches broken by the snow, pigs' hearts and stars, mystery, suspense and stingrays, insects, blood and interests and death. Eventually us, with all our viruses, laments and curiosities, all our songs and made-up stories, and our songs about the stories we've forgotten. And all that we've forgotten. And to hold it all together, God made time and those rhyming seasons that display decay.
Thank you. That was another incredible universe. We've moved through 3 universes so far. I wanted to pick up a thread, and I want to invite the audience to start posting your questions. There's already been so much rich content here, so please feel free to. And thanks for the appreciation, GA. I wanted to start with the thread, Pádraig, you have addressed in your poem. There's so many threads there, but the thread of, how should we say, earth and decay, and it's being present. I mean, I'm thinking of, we exist in the Anthropocene with our human impacts and, the things that we have done to Mother Earth. And of course, we're also in COVID, as Helen mentioned at the beginning, which has disrupted our worlds. And there's so much upheaval and sadness, but yet threads of joy. And I feel like all of that came through in your poem, but it comes through in Marianne's lament, and certainly comes through in the Rani and Aparna's fires of Varanasi. So I would love to hear from each of you, and maybe we can start with Rani and Aparna, about how you're navigating this through your work of joy and sadness, decay and emergence, and bringing it all through your art. So, Rani and Aparna.
Well, I have 2 things. that the belief that death is only a doorway to a new life brings resilience to 1 billion people in India. And I think that Varanasi is a symbol to this. And to see millions, if when you go to Varanasi, every day there are people thronging there to get a glimpse of the Ganges. I mean, it's not, life is very difficult. I mean, what we are told by ascetics and learned people that life is painful. As common people, we don't understand that except when it affects us or when it affects people who are close to us. But to have this idea that when you go to Varanasi, you take a dip in the Ganges, and we hear so many things about the Ganges. The Ganges is dirty, but it's not about what is present now, but it's about the deep belief. It's the belief that takes you through many difficult times, sad times, happy times, or whatever it is. So in Varanasi, for us, the main idea is we are expressing everything through dance. The residing deity of Varanasi, they say that Shiva's dance transforms the cremation ground into a wondrous experience of devotion, an interplanetary stage, which implies the principles of transcendence and acceptability of the idea of death as being inevitable in life. Now, Pádraig's poetry had all of it answered. God made all of us, all the good, the bad, the hard, the soft, the love, the hate. So we can't get out of it. We are here. The only way out of it is to die, but there is another door through which we can come back. And that is if we are constantly thinking of our actions, our thoughts, how we live, and we try to make it as best as possible, we can hope for a nice entryway into this world again. And that's what our piece is about.
Aparna, would you like to add something?
I don't think I can add anything to that.
Okay.
Pretty good.
All right. Okay, let's go to Marianne. What are your thoughts?
Joy and pain are two sides of the same coin. They're the point at which, when they're true, are when you let go. And they very much do the same thing for you as a human being. Within Gaelic culture, within Gaelic poetic culture, eulogy and elegy occupy a huge place. And the point at which you're elegizing, you're lamenting, and where it crosses over to celebrating the person and their attributes, it is a very smudgy one. And bringing it through to the present day, I come from the musical side of my family comes from quite a restrictive Christian church. But within it, they have a quite ecstatic form of sung praise. My grandfather sanctioned a family that sang and danced and played instruments where others would not have. And it took me many, many, many years to understand that a funeral rite that did not mention the person by name, sometimes didn't mention the family, sometimes didn't sanction the entry of the body into the church. I found this very, very difficult to deal with. But as I came to understand the way that people worshipped through there, I tried hard to understand how they were paying their respects and how their perception of God and their perception of humanity came together. I still haven't reconciled this, but I think I try to be more understanding.
Thank you, Marianne. The irreconcilable is something that has been present in the last couple of years as well. You know, the separation at death, you know, family members not being able to be there at the moment and so on. So there's something deep in what you're saying that connects to our current time too. So Pádraig, your poem started this thread. So what do you think?
I'll tell a story. Last year, a very close friend died. He died very suddenly. And Marianne and I were collaborating on a project of artists. It was her project. I was delighted to be involved, where 5 artists each sent a piece of work to each other. And then we responded through the senses. There was music, there was painting, there was sketching, there was poetry, photography, etc. So I had, because I was filled with grief, I'd written and was recording by audio an elegy for a friend. And while I was recording it, upstairs in a studio, a little chaffinch, a small bird, made its way through the window downstairs and hopped up the stairs. I had a friend staying with me, and my friend was terribly insistent and tried to be very quiet because he knew I was recording. And the bird stood outside the door where I was recording and tapped on the door. The bird did not seem to be distressed until my friend tried to get rid of it. But the bird seemed to know where it was going. Now, of course, a scientist would tell the proper analysis of that, but more than one thing can be true at once. And certainly in the Irish and in the Scottish tradition, and I think in many traditions around the world, there's ways within which people look at birds, especially after death, after having been bereaved, and see some element of flight, some element of hope, perhaps some element of the fact that you know that birds have a short life, but there's always going to be birds around, we hope, that they can rise up to the skies like we hope a prayer can. And there's a way within which I think the understanding of how we hold a narrative, a mythological narrative, we know it's not factual, but that's okay because it's not meant to be. It can nonetheless give a deep sense of comfort, and it can give a way of looking at the world, and by looking at the world, seriously paying attention to it, not just looking through it, but looking at the world. And I think that can be a very, very powerful thing. It can be comforting in that moment. When I came downstairs after having recorded that elegy that I then emailed on to Marianne, my friend was saying to me, there was a bird. And I thought it was so beautiful and so moving. But I think also what we have need of is rituals that name the violent side of the human capacity, as well as the recognition that destruction is a factor that happens. Obviously, there is human-created destruction that's happening in terms of all the violences we do to each other, as well as the impact of climate change. But way before climate change, there were also earthquakes. Of course there were. And what I find moving is that so many traditions have found a way to manifest destruction too within the panoply of gods that we imagine, in order to try to find a space also for those unanswerable questions about destruction that seems to lurk in amidst the creative chaos that we also have to pay attention to. And therefore, what Ragamala Dance showed earlier on, I thought was so powerful in the sense of the presence of life around the river, as well as the presence of great tension and restriction. And that complexity of life and tension, restriction and death, and then ritual to gather around death, I found very moving. Even though it's not a tradition that I'm from, I nonetheless feel myself drawn into a desire through a particularity to say something about the human experience.
I know Marianne's going to say something, I think, but I just think the story about the bird is so incredibly moving, because it also reminds us that even as we, experience things, to be present and to look for the signs that the earth and, the universe, the deities are sending us as we go along our life. Marianne, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add regarding what Pádraig produced for that Highland Whispers project. Even he created a thing within a thing within a thing to I don't know, to make sense of it, to give it a context. The poems that he wrote were handwritten on separate cards and then put in a little box in a lingophone, an old cassette box, and then wrapped up in a beautiful soft turquoise scarf, and then wrapped up and then sent to me in Scotland. And it gave a sense of the depth of feeling, of emotion, that sending this was a rite in itself. And I think there's something very important about that sense of layers, of sense of scale, that we are a huge story to ourselves, to our personal experience, to our community experience, to our global experience. But having been working on a project where I've been in a place formed by the oldest rocks on the planet, you then take the vastness of how we conceive of that human experience, and you lay it beside these rocks, and it's not even an instant. And ritualization and the making of stories, and some of the stories that I traced through how certain lochs were created or certain mountains, the use of story and myth to make sense of that vastness, to give some means of human being able to understand that is significant for me as well.
Thank you, Marianne. Aparna?
I just wanted to say just very briefly that it's just so beautiful what you both said, and Marianne, what you were talking about is this idea of vastness and longevity, and us, you know, as a mere kind of moment in all of that. And when we create something like this, when we create our work, that is what we aim to communicate with people, is the vastness of the dance form, the depth of the form, and all of the forms that are within it: poetic, music, the theatrical, the spiritual, and then using mythology to further explain that. So the idea, I think, as Rani said too, as perhaps Shiva as a symbol of creation and destruction, again and again and again shows us that as mere humans, we must suppress our egos, that we do not have control over all the things that we're all talking about, and that it is a much older and larger and wider set of interlocking traditions that we have the honor of being a part of.
Beautifully put. I think you're talking about the expansion, right, from the circle. I mean, sometimes in contemporary life, it comes back to the individual, and yet you're sort of expanding to the vastness of the universe. And I sense that in all your work. And one of my questions is, I would still love to see questions from the audience, but in the meantime, I have a question about what I sense in each of your work is the sense of agency. So on one hand, you're connecting to ancient lineages, and you're kind of bearing the responsibility of bringing it through somehow to our here and now. But at the same time, you're bringing your personal, your own interpretation, and we feel that, and we felt that with all the dancers. We feel that with Marianne's singing, and also with Pádraig's, your poetry. This agency, and also perhaps a kind of both a reverence and a irreverence as well, because you're navigating that and sort of putting your own perspective on it. So could you speak to that? I mean, any of you who would like to?
I can say just a few words about in our classical form. This art form has a vocabulary. and it's taught one-on-one from the teacher to the student. And there are many lineages, and we are very fortunate to be students of this amazing teacher in India. But this art form, even though it's believed to be 2000 years old, has always grown in the hands of the practitioner. So I would say it's almost like a writer. A writer comes up with an idea and writes. So do we. We come up with an idea and then go back to find sources. How do we present this idea as a piece? So our Files of Varanasi came from the experience of losing my father, and in a foreign country where he wouldn't have the same kind of rituals, death rituals that are done in India, the way he did it for his father. So, and when his ashes were taken to Varanasi, only then when it comes closer to you, do you pay more attention to this entire universe and world that is before you and in front of you. So we started this project, and it has taken us 2 years of research to find how do you connect all of these to make, Varanasi has its pilgrimage paths. It has the Ganges. It has so many different Hindu gods have had their signature, their little actions and activities and wonders that make up the city of Varanasi. So we had to be correct in our presentation. We couldn't, and at the same time, we are also creative. How do you bring them all together? What is it that we want to show? So that's how it becomes ours, but it also, you have great responsibility in bringing the myths correctly and not, messing with that. So that's how we own that piece in that way.
Thank you, Pádraig.
In poetry, I think there's an idea of knowing form really well in order to be able to break it a little bit. So you might write a broken sonnet, but I think you need to know it first in order to be able to do something more interesting with it. I mean, Picasso would be another example, perhaps, of thinking of understanding a form of classical painting in order afterwards to take what was fine art and to move it into doing something on a different dimensional plane, really, for the eye. And I think that has always been the way with religious tradition. There's an idea, of course, that religious tradition has always and always was, that everybody had this mythology from all the way back. But somebody wrote it once. Somebody came up with the first idea, and then somebody else said, "That's a really good beginning, but I'm going to add to it." And then somebody else said, "I hate the ending. I'm going to supply an alternative ending." And these are the kinds of literary endeavors that formed the sources about what we now call sacred scriptures across the world in all our traditions. But they all began in the mind of an artist. And then another artist came along and said, "Nice try. I'm going to make it better." And so art has continually broken and re-emerged. And in a certain sense, each of those is a little death, and each of those is a little birth. And so within the context of this, you're paying attention to how art is always seeking to reach its own edges. And that can be painful for the original artist. But I think there's something really interesting in the way that it is continually forming and reforming, breaking and being unmade and being remade. And that, I think, is an invitation. I love cities with graffiti because graffiti is so interesting to see how people graffiti and then another layer and another layer and another layer gets added to it. It's an extraordinary form of interactive art. And I tend to think of scriptures like a certain form of codified graffiti, in the sense of that what you see is an extended argument that's been happening over a period of the production of that piece of art.
That's amazing. Codified graffiti as scripture. Fantastic. I'm going to turn to Marianne, and I know we're wrapping up in time, but there is a question I'd love to hear each artist elaborate more on elements of timeliness and timelessness in creative function. So Mary, could you take that? And then after that, I'll turn it over to Helen to wrap this up. Yeah.
I'd like to say, I was going to say that for me, Pádraig is the perfect embodiment of Celtic irreverence. And then he just proved it with his last couple of sentences. And we have this habit of unsaying, of not saying truly what's in your heart for fear of bringing down something bad on the person you care about. But in terms of timelessness, I very much believe, partly, very much in part because I belong to a minority culture, that you truly have to know where you've come from, that you have to have an awareness and an understanding and a delving into what you've been given in that continuum of language, of culture, of that particular facet on the prism through which light is refracted for you, as for me as a Gaelic speaker, and growing up where I have and being given what I have. You have to have all of that, and it is timeless in many ways. It's just this whole hinterland before you can take it into the present, to break it and make it your own and remain part of the continuum in a way that actually has the strength and ability to look further into the future. So it's a really hack thing to say you need to know where you've come from to know where you're going. But for me, it's you've got to do the work before you can start saying, right, I'm going to try this and I'm going to go off at a different route, and you need that, not awareness of individual things, but to have this appreciation of the vast, timeless, communal gift that you've been given, that you then can play with and send forward to the next people.
Thank you so much for those insights. I'm deeply grateful to have been able to meet you and you all and host this conversation. It has certainly expanded my world, but I also expect that that's happened to our audience as well. So thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Helen to close us out. Thank you.
Okay. Helen, I think you're muted. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that's the phrase of the year is you're on mute, I have to say. So sorry about that. I do feel sorry to have to bring this actually to a close, because it's been a really rich and beautiful conversation, and there's been something that I feel that everyone has talked about that moves me a lot. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about people who I'm watching just over the images over the last year of people who where rituals are entirely disrupted. Those are incredibly important moments in someone's death and family and memory, and all of those things have been just thrown away because of the speed of having to be buried, or the speed of having to, or lining up, you know what I mean? The kind of the images of lining up coffins and everything having to happen at such a kind of pace. And my question is, how do you find paradise if you die in a foreign country, or if it's all of those links to your to where you go to are somehow broken. Those bridges are somehow broken. And but I do believe in the artists to remake the sacred in any place and at any time and anywhere. And I think that's where the power of the artist really belongs. And that's just in all three of you, and been really talking about that, of how you, by your recreation of that you're reinventing the sacred in a way, even for the people with no faith like me, so it's kind of complex in all of that. So thank you so much. And I just want to thank Rani and Aparna and Marianne and Pádraig and Virajita for a really, really beautiful conversation. For our audience, I'm going to do a quick plug for a piece of work that's at the end of the festival, which is a Requiem for 2020, which we've commissioned. It's called No Alleluias. It's actually based on the Reverend Karen Georgia Thompson's journey of losing her father and burying her father in the States while also being ill from COVID herself. The image that we're using on the website is actually her photograph out from, she was only allowed to photograph her father's funeral through the car door window. She wasn't allowed out. And, you know, 4 men in full white hazmat suits took her father away very quickly. And so she, as a pastor, was also really having to think the impact of that and the meaning of all of those kind of moments for her. So the Requiem is on Saturday, and you can book through our website to do that. And you can pay some money. You can pay no money. You're very welcome. Please join us on that. And with that, I will say thank you and good night to all our audience and all our panelists. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.